Excellent. Thank you very much. Being inspired about, from what Anne just said, we're looking at probably the worst problem in the world. So, anyway, I thought I would start here. Here we go again. Over the last few years, 4 Danes, not 3 as it says in this headline, have died due to infections that have emerged from animals. Newspapers are full of the stories, all over the front page. Politicians are alarmed, experts are calling for action, and the authorities are as usual struggling to find the appropriate level and nature of response. So I'm going to tell you the very sad story about antibiotic resistance coming from animals to humans and causing public health harm. It is, as Anne alluded to, a slowly emerging crisis. I liken it with a very slow tsunami. We're standing on the beach, looking straight at it. We're not moving, we're not acting, but we're intensely discussing whether we want to build a dike or a lifeboat or just learn to swim. But we're only discussing. So, looking at this idyllic picture, it is what we call a classical tragedy of the commons problem. Tragedy of the commons refers to the story of the old English commons where the villagers would put their animals out to graze on the commons. It was a shared community-owned pasture. As villagers became wealthier and wealthier, each year they would put more animals out onto the commons and eventually, of course, overgrazing the commons so they could no longer sustain their livestock. So every villager in pursuit of his own individual wealth would overgraze the limited shared resource. So that's the problem that we also face with antibiotic resistance. As long as the decision to use antibiotics is primarily an individual decision by veterinarians or by farmers in the context that I'm talking about, there is a real risk that we, in our individual efforts to be as effective or safe as possible, degrade our common limited resource and unwillingly bring the antibiotic miracle to an end. Of course, modern intensive animal production has changed quite a bit from its historical roots at the commons. The extreme intensification of livestock production, which we have witnessed since the late 50s, be it in agriculture or not to forget aquaculture, is built on and to a very large extent has depended on a very liberal use of inexpensive antibiotics. Antibiotics perform the farmers to have very high animal densities, to wean animals very early before they are physiologically ready to be moved from their mother, to commingle extremely large groups of immunologically naive animals, to use substandard or nutritionally imbalanced feeds, to reduce on hygiene and biosecurity, and to transport animals over extremely long distances. Now, all these management tools taken together, of course, has increased efficiency tremendously, has reduced production cost, has created cheaper food in the stores, but it also comes with a substantial risk, namely that we risk losing the antibiotics that we are pouring into this system. The antibiotics that we use in animals are exactly the same as the antibiotics that we use in humans, and they cause exactly the same kind of resistance that harms humans. But they are, as we also heard earlier, administered in a distinctly different way. They are given routinely to entire flocks of animals. They are given routinely in the feed and in the water. They are given routinely to healthy animals, and in many parts of the world, they are given simply for something called growth promotion, so nothing to do with the management of disease, mainly just in the belief that if you give antibiotics, animals grow faster. So it should come as no surprise that the amounts of antibiotics that are used in agriculture globally are considerably higher than the amounts of antibiotics that we use in humans. Now, use of antibiotics, as we know, breeds resistant bacteria, and indiscriminate use breeds enormous amounts of resistant bacteria. And these bacteria do transmit from animals to humans. Some of you might wonder, how does this take place? Well, mainly because we have decided to eat the animals. That's actually why we raise them. So most of the infections do transmit by the foodborne route. But obviously there are many other routes, through the environment, through contact, and many other ways. It is complex, but not terribly difficult. Most of these infections originate in the farm, in the animals that were raised for our food supply. So, some years ago, actually now 10 years ago, the three global organizations, WHO, FAO, and OIE, that's the World Animal Health Organization, convened a meeting where they pulled together all the experts in the world on this topic and asked them, is this a real problem? And the conclusion was very straightforward. Yes, there is strong scientific evidence that antibiotic resistance emerges in food animals, that it transmits to humans, and that it leads to more infections in humans, that is, infections that would otherwise not have occurred, more serious infections in humans, and, of course, more causes of death. Now, in light of this very clear conclusion, of course, the important question remains, what can we do to contain the problem? The most effective way is to reduce the overall amount of antibiotics that are being used in animals. And furthermore, to avoid using the antibiotics that are considered critically important for human medicine. Reducing overuse and misuse in modern agriculture seems to be a low-hanging fruit, but obviously it lies in the very nature of the problem that the individual farmers and the individual veterinarians' perception of what is appropriate use may differ substantially from what is the society's idea about appropriate use. Farmers compete to produce animals as effective as possible. It's a business. And obviously, if antibiotics are like doping, the more you add, the faster you go, there is a tendency to add more antibiotics. Veterinarians in Europe and the rest of the world generate a large fraction, in most parts of the world, the major fraction of their income from the direct sale of drugs. Most of these drugs are antibiotics. So there is a very strong financial incentive. And obviously, pharmaceutical industry exert very large marketing pressure on farmers and veterinarians to use the most advanced and the newest drugs that had just been developed because they have to recoup development costs. So, all incentives push all the actors in the wrong direction. And in my eyes, there is only one way to cope with this, which is also the way you cope with tragedy or common problems: regulation. You have to fence in the things so each individual gets his own fair share of the common good, literally speaking. Europe is far ahead of the rest of the world when it comes to regulating antibiotics in farm animals, I should say, in all fairness. Farmers in Europe, unlike the rest of the world, cannot buy drugs over the counter. Farmers in Europe cannot use antibiotics for growth motion. But we have to go further. The next important step, as was also mentioned before, is to reduce the overall amount of antibiotics that are being used, that is prescribed, because we have them only on prescription in Europe, by veterinarians. To do that, I think it's a reasonable question to ask, how much is prescribed? And one might think that these data are readily available, but actually until recently, we didn't have data on how much antibiotics were being used by farmers in Europe in the different countries. They were considered proprietary information by the pharmaceutical industry. But this has fortunately changed. So in 2007, EMA, the European Medicines Agency, tried to collect for the first time from the countries that had these data available, data on how much antibiotics are being used. The graph shows how much antibiotics used to produce 1 kilogram of meat. And as you can see, there are huge differences. Apparently, Dutch farmers use 10 times more antibiotics than Norwegian farmers to produce 1 kilogram of meat. Now, obviously, the Dutch politicians did not like what they saw. See, that's the power of data and transparency. And they decided that if Scandinavia can produce meat with a significantly lower input of antibiotics, so can the Dutch. And they dictated some very ambitious reduction targets for their industry. So this is Dutch use as it unfolded up until 2007. The politicians simply said by 2011 reduced by 20%, by 2013 by 50%, and by 2015 by 70%. 70% reduction in use. So let's see how it went. By 2011, they were already far ahead. By 2013, they are also ahead of the curve. And this is where they want to be in 2015. So political decision and determination can make changes. One of the keys to the great success of the Dutch program is transparency. Make available the data on the use of the individual farmer and the prescribing patterns of the individual veterinarians, and make them compete to be the best. Best practice competition is a very strong driver. In Denmark, we have a similar system. We call it the yellow card system. If a farmer consistently prescribes or uses more than his peers, if a veterinarian prescribes much more than his colleagues, he gets a yellow card from the authorities, reminding him that he's probably a little bit out of the ordinary and should see how he could improve his practices. So, coming back to our comments, antibiotic resistance in animals transmits to humans. It has serious public health consequences. We have to reduce the overall amount of antibiotics. I hope I made that very clear. Europe has the recipe for success. We have to establish in Europe a friendly and science-driven competition, a race to the bottom. We have to reinvent agriculture. We have to reinvent agriculture so it can produce efficiently without being drug dependent. We have to learn from each other, from the best countries, from the best regions, from the best veterinarians, and from the best farmers. The question is basically to find out how low can we go. And we already have a positive benchmark. Organic animal production in Europe uses less than 1/10 the amounts of antibiotics that are used by conventional producers. So there's a lot we can learn and plenty of room for improvement. So I say let Europe lead the world by example. Let's find out how low we can go on drug use in agriculture, and let's protect antibiotics for the benefit of all of us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Henrik. And a positive note to end on. Now, just before we take some questions, as you'll see already immediately on the screen behind me, this is now we're going to try you on one of these polls. So if you've lost the website to go to, www.govote.at, entry code, if you need it again, 445622. If I keep saying that, somebody's going to shout out house. So that's a British bingo joke, by the way. So here's the question with just 3 options. Which of the following strategies do you consider to be the most important to manage antibiotic resistance from animals? 1, regulate. 2, research. 3, relax. I didn't think we were going to get many for the relax, but I'm going to give you another 20 seconds for voting, because there's more people in the room than that. And we're past the 50 mark. Okay, I think that's probably enough. Thank you for voting, much appreciated. Henrik, I'm sure you're not particularly surprised by that result, are you?
No, I tried to have it that way by my presentation.
Questions for Henrik? Gentleman there. We've got microphones coming in on your right-hand side.
Søren Molin from the same university as Henrik. So,
it's a plant.
I do agree with you on all the things you said, but isn't it true that it's quite surprising that the number of cases where you have transmission and cause of death is very low? I mean, 3 over a several-year period compared to what you might expect from the massive use of antibiotics in agriculture.
Yeah, my example was only on the MRSA, which is just one out of many bugs that transmit from animals to humans. And of course, you could say the cases where you can actually document a direct link to animals is, whatever way you look at it, always very limited because of the complexity of the system. So whether it's the resistance gene that transmit from animals to humans but jump into a bacterium in humans and then causing infections, you know as well as I that the genes are the same. They go around and they jump from one species to the other. So tracking and tracing is very difficult. At the end of the day, I often come back to the number that we all kind of accept. 3 out of 4 new and emerging infectious diseases originate in animals. Actually, most of the new and emerging infections that come to humans comes from animals. We don't invent them. Animals invent them for us. It's a much more diverse biological community. and they mix and mingle and do fun stuff out there and pick up genes that make them pathogenic, pick up genes that make them resistant. But since we mingle with the animals, either because we move into nature where we haven't been living before or we eat the animals, we get in contact with the infectious agents.
But do you not worry that somebody hearing that, there'll be people who hear that and go, well, if 3 out of 4 of the diseases are coming from animals, let's just give the animals more antibiotics. People misunderstand what happens.
I take that point, but again, as for antibiotic resistance, the only solution I see is to reduce the use of antibiotics. Then some say, why don't we just use biosecurity or infection control? We do that already. We try to keep the animals healthy. We try to keep our food safe. That's the general food safety policy. But we need to put something on top of that, which is antibiotic resistance control policies. So we already have the food safety and trying to keep our meat in the slaughterhouses clean, pasteurizing our milk. But we see foodborne diseases, actually several hundred millions of them every year in the world, coming across anyway. So we need to do something specific to reduce transmission of resistance. And the most effective way to do that is not trying to reduce the number of bacteria, is trying to reduce selective pressure by antibiotics.
Okay, I want to squeeze in another question if I can. Short answers, please. Short question if possible.
Shouldn't you just be encouraging vegetarianism?
No, I think that's an individual choice. I wouldn't regulate for vegetarianism, whereas I would encourage politicians to regulate on antibiotic use.
I guess vegetarian wouldn't harm, though, would it?
No. And vegetarians also get resistant bacteria from animals because most of the plants are anyway contaminated with bacteria that has gone through the environmental reservoir from manure and other sources.
One more.
What will be the costs of regulation? After all, restricting antibiotics is a bit like regulating pharmaceuticals, namely that we make a judgment that we are going to take some deaths from patients today because we restrict antibiotics for hopefully having more saved potentially tomorrow. And there is that's a very difficult calculation to do, and especially if we're going to do food so much more expensive in times of crisis and economic downturn in Europe, especially in agriculture.
But that is
I need your answer to be shorter than the question.
That is assuming that food will be more expensive. That's why I say let's make this a best practice competition and a race to the bottom. Because we can actually take out, I would argue, without any effect on effectiveness of production, half of the antibiotics that are used in animals. I would argue, with a little insight I have, that most of the use is actually useless. So we are taking money out of the farmers' pockets because they have to pay for the antibiotics. And I think we should stop doing that. And I think we should make sure that they use the antibiotics strictly necessary, no more, no less. And there's so much we can improve on in production hygiene, biosecurity, and other factors that will prevent that we need antibiotics. So no more use than strictly necessary, and strictly necessary is much lower than where we are now in most countries. These huge differences between countries is not because animals in the Netherlands are 10 times more sick than animals in Norway. I'm sorry to say that, that's not the case. So it's another thing, it's something in the culture, it's something in the practice, it's other factors, and those we should control. So it's not about making food more expensive. Maybe a little bit, I wouldn't worry too much about that in Europe, but I'm sure it'll have very little.
But faith that political pressure for how low can you go can make a difference. Can we please thank Professor Henrik Caspar Wegener again, thank you.